everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to do the paper piecing for the flower units for our Impatiens pattern. We've already done the cutting for it, but before I get started on the paper piecing, I want to pick up a little bit of information in the pattern just so that you can, just to give you some more general information. The tools that you're going to want to use for the paper piecing, you're going to need to use the add a quarter ruler, and this is an add a quarter ruler. You're going to use some washout fabric glue sticks, and we're also going to use a glue stick that's for a repositionable glue stick. So we're going to use those with our paper piecing. In the pattern, it lists that we're going to use flower pins. We probably won't use the flower pins, but on occasion, I always have you put flower pins in so that if you decide you need to pin something, the flower pins work really good because they're flat, and you can lay them flat on the paper if you have to pin something. We also have a fold template. Now, a fold template is just a piece of template plastic. We cut these out of old template plastic, or we buy new template plastic, and we cut them in all different widths and different lengths. Mostly we cut them to match our rulers or the size of the pattern that we're working with. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is on the foundation papers, and I'm going to pull this out. Pull them out of here. People who are new to paper piecing sometimes don't read the information that's put in the pattern thorough enough, and they make the mistake of sewing on the wrong line. So I want you guys to take note that you always sew on the solid line. The dash line references the edge of your seam allowance, and it also references which way the seam allowance is going to be pressed. And sometimes we mark the dash lines because that also gives us the actual size of the piece on the back side of our pattern. And most of my instructions tell you to mark the dash lines on the back side of each of your foundation papers. We normally only do it on one, but if you're new, it's not going to hurt if you do the whole set like that. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is it tells you in your instructions you need Ziploc bags. We use the Ziploc bags to separate, like if we're going to do two flowers out of two colors, then two flowers out of another two colors, then we'd separate the two colorways. If we have more than one unit that we're working with, then we would put each unit into a different bag. So that's what the Ziploc bags are for. Some other general information that I want to tell you is your fabric width. All of our instructions are written to use 42-inch wide fabric. Now, sometimes you have fabric that's 39 inches, sometimes you have fabric that's 40, sometimes you have fabric that is 44 inches. We chose 42. That's how we set up all of our drawings and all of our math. And so if you have fabric that's a little bit less than 42, you're going to have to take that into consideration because you may have to get a little bit more fabric. If you make cutting errors, you're probably going to have to contact us to get some additional paper here at Quiltworx, or if it's something really simple, you can actually tape your paper back together if it's a simple cut, just like one line that you cut incorrectly. But we will help you if you make a mistake. We will help you make sure that you get what you need to finish your project. The other thing I want to bring up is fabric swatches. We use a lot of fabric swatches, so you can see I put a fabric swatch on this foundation unit, on this one, and what that fabric swatch is telling me is the color fabric that I want on that particular foundation paper. We're using 5 different fabrics for the large background part of the flower, and then all of our spikes we only chose 1 fabric for in the blocks that I'm going to demonstrate. We're going to keep going through some general information. Your stitch length on your machine, when you're doing paper piecing and you're working with newsprint, you should have your stitch length somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9. You're going to have to test that, and an easy way to test it is just to stitch on the paper and your fabric, and then tear the paper away and see if it tears away nicely. If it leaves a whole bunch of loops in your thread, in your stitch line, then you're going to want to tighten that stitch a little bit. You don't want the stitch to get really loose, because it will, when you tear the paper, leave loops. So you need to make sure it's tight enough. If you get it too tight, it's going to cut your paper, and that's not going to help you either. So you want to, there's a fine line between what's good and what's bad. Thread size, I normally use a size 50 or a size 60. You don't want to get into a 40 weight. Your 40 weights are going to be too heavy, and they're going to leave holes and probably tear the paper when you're sewing if you're working with newsprint. The needle size, I usually work with a size 70 needle with the newsprint. You can use an 80. It's fine. If you get into a size 90 needle with the newsprint, it's probably going to tear, cause the paper to tear easily in the sewing process, which makes it harder to work with. Your newsprint is just lighter weight than normal typing paper, and so I would stay away from the size 90 needles when you're working with the newsprint. Template pieces. In your pattern, you always have different types of templates, and so you need to pay attention and read what type of template you have. If it's a paper piecing template, it's just going to be, normally you'll find that, and it's called a template layout sheet, unless it's a single template. But a paper piecing template's always going to have excess fabric around the actual size of the template, as if you were going to do traditional piecing. And I'll show you with this particular piece right here and explain that to you. So if you look at this template right here, are we on, can you see the paper? Okay, if we look at this template, we have a solid line on the inside. That solid line represents the finished size of that piece after it's all sewn together. The dashed line includes the seam allowance around that. Okay, so you have to have, if I was doing traditional piecing, I would actually cut right on that dashed line. Paper piecing, you're always going to have excess fabric around that dashed line, and depending on where it's going to fall on your layout sheet will determine on how much excess fabric is there, right? There's a couple more things on my list I want to go through. I told you about the fabric glue. There's sew side. That's also here. So I'm going to grab another template piece. And on this template piece, it's written on here that this is my sew side, and it says sew side. The sew side is very important. We figured out back in about 2000 and it was probably 2002 that we had to know what the sew side was in order to put that fabric underneath the section that we were trying to sew on. So if we're trying to cover section 2 on a foundation unit, we have to know the sew side so we know how to position the fabric underneath it. And so we started adding the sew sides to all of our templates, actually typing it on. So when you get a pattern, you're always going to have a sew side unless it's the very first section, and because this first section really doesn't have a sew side until after you trim with the 1/4" seam allowance. So always pay attention to the sew side, because we use that when we do our stacking. And then there's the pressing. when we give you instructions for pressing, it's normally after the foundation paper has been done and when you start to assemble, because in the press, when you're doing foundation paper piecing, the pressing is determined by the order in which you're sewing all of your pieces onto. So you don't go back and repress after you sew something on unless it's the very last piece on a unit, and in this particular pattern that's not going to happen. All right. Then we're going to go to the fabric charts, the yardage chart, and you can kind of see on my booklet here that I went through and actually put a fabric swatch for all of my different fabrics. And in my particular, the flowers I'm making all 4 of them the same way. Well, we gave you 2 different colorways, so you could make 2 flowers one way and then 2 color flowers the other way with other fabrics. And so when we listed all those numbers, we actually have the first colorway is fabric A, B, C, D, E, and then on the second one we listed the fabrics F, G, H, I, and J. So we use the alphabet to determine when we have more than one fabric. We would go fabric A, fabric B. If we have 3 fabrics, we're going to go fabric A, fabric B, fabric C. And that's just the number of times that the number of fabrics that we're using for the same foundation unit. Because if I'm making 8 pieces, I could make every one of those foundation papers and use a different color. So somehow we have to be able to determine how many colors we have. I like to build my fabric chart. Then I like to pair these up to my foundation papers. And so if you see, I have them paired up to that. But the other place I like to pair things up is I like to go through the cutting instructions. And before I actually start cutting, I like to make sure that I put a fabric swatch along the cutting area so that I know if I have 4 different colors, I know that when I get to that I have to make sure I have my 4 colors stacked properly before I do any cutting. So those are just a few tips that I wanted to go over with you. Now the next thing I'm going to show you is when you go through your instructions, at the beginning of your instructions, before you do any cutting, there's a very small section that talks about chain piecing. And chain piecing is how we do all of our foundation paper piecing. So basically, instead of doing 1 block at a time, if we have 5 blocks, we're going to prepare all 5 blocks, sew all 5 blocks, trim all 5 blocks. And it's just a process of chain piecing, which we do with traditional quilting all the time. In paper piecing, when you don't cut template pieces and you're only working with chunks of fabric, it's really hard to do chain piecing. But when we actually design template pieces, then we can cut 8 pieces or 12 pieces. They're all the same size, and we can actually run the whole stack of foundation papers through at the same time. So when you get into the actual paper piecing, before you start, you're going to have an area there where it tells you to actually sort your fabrics and stack everything in the order that you're going to do the paper piecing. And that's where we're going to start this video at this point to teach you how to do paper piecing. And so in this pattern, I'm on page 7, and at the top of page 7, it has all of my instructions on how to stack. I'm only going to make 5, and I've already put a fabric swatch on here. But the other thing I want to do is I want to mark my papers, and I'm going to go fabric. I'm going to look at my fabrics and make sure I mark these, because my fabrics are already stacked. This is my first color, second color. So I'm going to find my fabric papers that I put my swatches on, and I'm going to set it up in the same order. So my very first color is actually on the bottom. This would be my fabric number 5. So I'm going to put that on the bottom. Then we're going to go to the next color, And that one is actually my number 4 paper. Then we're going to go to this one. And that one, I believe, sometimes it's hard to see when you're working with something with lots of color in it. This one, I believe, is, yep, this is my number 3 paper. This one is my number 2 paper. And this is number 1 paper. So now I have my papers in the same order as my fabric. Now you might think that that's kind of silly to go through that effort, but the nice thing about it is when I have to leave the project and come back to finish it up, or I might leave it for somebody else to work on, then I can just tell them, just make sure the papers that when you start over each time you sew a new piece on, that you have to make sure that your papers are still in order from 1 through 5. And that's going to match every single pile that we've cut for our templates, right? So now I've already got these stacked, but I'm going to go back through the stacking process with you. After you get done with the stacking, there's a page and a half of actual foundation instructions, and I'm not going to read them through you step by step. You're just going to watch me do this. But when you guys get your pattern, just read them, because I'm going to be showing you the same exact steps that's in the instructions. Every pattern we do with paper piecing, these steps are almost identical. The only time they change is like if we have a unit that we have to do some curved piecing on halfway through the unit. So sometimes there's special instructions, but in general, all of our paper piecing is the same. And so I'm just going to go through and show you with the actual pieces. We're going to clean off our table. The only thing I need on my table right now are these pieces, and everything else we can set aside, including my instructions. And you don't need the paper clip on here. I'm going to put my glue sticks down here, set these off to the side, and I'm going to show you the stacking process. So you always start with the largest number, section number on your template is the bottom piece. So my last number on my foundation paper, the section, is section 9. So this template is for section 9. This template piece, it doesn't have any paper on it, but I happen to know that this is for section 7 because I've made 3 of these already. This template is, or this is section 8. This template is for section 7. And notice that I'm keeping the sew side along this edge on every one of them. I don't want to flip that sew side. This one is for section 6. This template reads section 5. This is for section 4. This template says section 3. This template is for section 2. And this template is for section 1. And section 1 does not have a sew side on it, right? So we're just going to stack all of these. Everything is cut and stacked right side up. Now we're going to grab our glue pen this is repositionable glue. And I'm going to take my very first piece of paper, and we're going to pull the paper clip off of this. And we're going to take our paper and we're going to hold it kind of up in the air. And I'm going to look to see exactly, and I'm going to match the template, those lines on my template up with the lines on the front of my paper so that I can see how that very first piece is supposed to sit. And then after I get that done, I'm going to flip my fabrics Actually, I'm going to leave them just like that. And then all I have to do is flip each one over. So now I can take this and I'm going to put the wrong side up and place it on my paper. Then I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to put it back in that same position. And I'm using the repositionable glue. And that repositionable glue, I don't want that on anything other than under section 1. And now I'm going to put it back in place. And I kind of forgot how I had it positioned, but there we go. It's almost a perfect match. Once I get the first one positioned properly, it's easy to position everything else. So I'm just going to match up the next piece of fabric right on top of that one. We're going to put our repositionable glue, and then I'm going to take my paper and place that right on top of the first one. And this, we just repeat this 5 times. Now we have all of the fabric underneath all 5 papers. And you can see I have a whole bunch of excess fabric on this, so I'm going to clean that off. So I have everything stacked pretty close. So I'm just going to come in here. I don't want to be right next to the paper because I don't want to take the chance of cutting anything. And I'm just going to kind of come down and get us a whole bunch of that excess off. After I get that done, then I'm going to turn them, and I'm going to pick up the very first paper. And now number 5's on the top, so I'm going to take number 5. We're going to place this right on line 1, and it's the solid line. You're going to fold back the foundation paper. You're going to grab your add a quarter ruler, which has a 1/4 inch lip on the back, and you're going to hold on to the fold template, put your hand on it, put the add a quarter, butt it up to the edge of that template in paper, and then you're going to trim a 1/4 inch line. Now you're going to just take this, you're going to leave it folded back and then set it off to the side. Then we're going to take the next piece, we're going to do the same thing, trim the excess, and then stack this on top of the other one. And you don't need to stack it right on, just kind of stagger these pieces a little bit. Then we're going to take paper number 3, trim, stack. Now we're on paper number 2. Trim, stack. And now we have number 1. And number 1 is also my color number 1, which is the top piece on my fabric. Although the next piece that's going on is actually my yellow spikes, and all the yellow spikes are the same number, or the same color. So we're going to pull these pieces off of our stack, get rid of the paper clips. This is my sew side. This is an actual rectangle, so the sew side is the same on both, but if that wasn't a rectangle, I would have to know where my sew side is. So here's my sew side. I'm going to pick up this piece. Now I have to know where to position that, and if you're new to paper piecing, you may not know how to set that on. So I'm going to open this up, and we're going to take and we're going to place the fold template on line 2 on the solid line. Then we're going to slide it over to the dashed line, and we're going to crease the paper. Okay, I don't have a light box. If I had a light box, I could just flip it over and mark it on with my light box, and I would be marking the dashed line, so that, because I'm adding section 2, so I have to mark along the dashed line on the outside of section 2. Now that I've creased that, I can flip this over and I can see my creases, and I can actually draw where I creased. So now, after I do that, I'm going to fold it back, and now you can see that this is where I have to cover, is this section right here. I don't have to worry about anything else other than that area being covered. All right, so take a good look. Now I have to position this piece of fabric underneath that. So we're going to lift the fabric and the paper, and you're going to hold on to it. Then you take your fingers and hold the fabric on the bottom against the table, and you're going to place that fabric so it covers this area, and then you line it up with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once I get that done, I can take this and I can add my next one, and I'm going to stagger this a little bit. Then I just have to pick this one up. I don't have to remark the second one. All I have to do is pay attention, basically, and make sure that my paper's centered the same as the piece before. So now you can see how straight that is. All of my paper has fabric under it. So now we're going to grab our fabric glue pen here. And what I'm going to do is come up and lift the fabric that's glued to the paper right now up. And I'm going to put the glue and glue between what's going to become your seam allowance. Just put a little bit of glue there, and that will hold those pieces together so they don't slide when you go to pick this up and put it on your machine to sew. Now, after you're an experienced paper piecer using this technique, you may find that the glue is just a waste of your time. But when you're first starting, the glue really helps you when you move the fabric. It helps you handle the, keep everything together when you put it under your machine. And the glue is not going to hurt your machine. It's going to be dry before I pick that up. All right. Because it only takes just a short time to pick it up. So now when I actually go to lift this, see how my pieces are glued together? So now all I have to do is just hold that against my paper. We're going to go to our machine. We're going to set my stitch length. On this machine, I like to use 1.8 stitch length. And every machine is going to be a little bit different, so you need to test that. I'm going to bring my needle up. And then I'm going to take my first paper. Now I can open it up and run the paper this way and sew down line 1, or I can flip it and sew on line 1 going this way. It just depends on how much room you have in this space on how you do it. But whatever way you choose, if I'm going to turn it this way, then I want to take my whole pile and turn it this way, so I don't have half of them going one way and half to go the other. We're going to start sewing off the paper, and I'm going to just sew a few stitches on just the fabric, because this line goes all the way down to the end of the paper. And we're going to actually sew on line 1, and it is a solid line. When I get to the end of line 1, I'm going to sew past the dashed line 2 to 3 stitches. I don't want to sew off all the paper because these points stop way down in the middle of the paper, but stop. Give yourself an extra 3 to 4 stitches past that dashed line. Now we're going to pick up the next piece and we're going to set it up here. If you have a machine that cuts your thread, you can actually cut the thread and then start with the next piece. If your machine doesn't have a thread cutter, you're just going to slide that piece back and you're going to start the next one. And then we're going to do the next one. I noticed my camera is wiggling just a little bit as I sew. I was looking at it because I thought maybe I ran out of thread, but I didn't. So now we're going to take this and we're going to cut the threads and we're going to just keep these stacked in order, and then we're going to go to the iron. I don't think I plugged in the iron, so we're going to do finger pressing with this demo. All right, so we're going to take the top piece, which is number 5, and I'm just going to finger press this, and that'll work just fine for what we're doing. And then we're going to take the next one, and Judal is going to plug my iron in for the next one. Thank you. And I'm going to wiggle it so it knows I'm here. Notice that I'm not getting my papers out of order. I'm keeping everything in order. And now we're to the top, the very last one. So now I have paper number 1 on the top. So I'm going to pick up the first piece and we're going to place the fold template on line 2. And where I sewed through the you're going to notice that your line goes all the way up past your dashed line, so you're going to have to fold the fabric with it like that, and then you're going to come in and you're going to grab that and you're going to tear that right down that line until the fabric lays flat for you. Now we're going to grab the fold, add a quarter ruler, and we're going to trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is paper number 1, so I'm just going to pick up my template pieces right now, and I'm going to take the others off. We're done with those. And I'm going to look to see where I'm supposed to actually position that. So I can see here's my dashed line. So I want to be down about that far from the edge of my paper. And I'm going to draw you some lines here. So here's actually the top part of the flower where I drew there. And I'm going to open it up and I'm going to do the same thing. So this is section 3. I'm going to place my fold template right next to the solid line and then slide it over to the dash line that's 1/4 of an inch parallel to it. And then we're going to crease it on that dash line. After I get that done, then I'm going to place my fold template back on line 2 where I actually trimmed, and I'm going to draw a line. Can you see where I drew that line? That's where I folded it. And so now this is the area that I have to cover. From the top of the paper down to here, this is my bottom. So I'm going to pick up the very first color, and I just leave the template right next so I always know. And then we're going to place that. This is my sew side. I lift this up and I'm going to position that right along the raw edge of the fabric, and I'm going to double check to make sure that the fabric's covering. And I need to scoot it up just a hair. There we are. Now we're on. Okay, so now I'm going to slide this piece over like that, and this is my next piece. Well, I'll just leave that there, and then we're going to do that again. Fold it back and then tear that fabric until it lays flat and trim. And then make sure that I'm on. I need to slide it down just a little bit. And you may need to mark the top of that to make sure that that's covering properly for you. And we're good. And we're going to repeat this process. Okay, as we add this last piece, one of the things I want to bring to your attention is that sometimes the very first piece we had a lot of excess on it. The last piece, as we move forward through these, you're going to find that you don't have near the excess on all of the other pieces. And so you have to pay a little bit more attention as when you start sewing those or positioning that fabric. And right now I'm refolding and finding the top position of that last piece, which is right here. And I just want to go over it again with you. Right, so I have my piece here. Here's where it's supposed to be fitting. So see, I don't have a lot of excess, so I've got to make sure that this point right here comes in at about right there. So when I place that in there, it's a pretty tight fit, but it covers the way it's supposed to. All right, we're going to place this on here, and now we're going to grab that glue pen again, and I'm going to glue everything, and then we'll sew it. So just lift up the fabric that's attached to your paper and glue the fabric that you just added. So I'm actually putting the glue on the fabric for section 3, and I'm folding back the seam allowance on section 2 fabric. When you glue like this, you need to do that gluing after it's stacked, because if you just go and put a bunch of glue on your paper or on your fabric before you put the two pieces together, you're going to get way too much glue on it. You need to keep that glue within that seam allowance area so it doesn't show on your fabric. So now we're going to pick up these pieces again, and I'm going to see if it fits under my machine just fine. And I think I'm still going to, I think I'm going to start this way. So I'm going to leave my stack like that. We're going to start at the top of the paper. We're going to sew a few stitches before we hit the paper. And now we're sewing on line 2. And I'm going to pull these little samples off as I go because I have my fabric sewn to it now, so I don't need the fabric sample. And when I get to the bottom of the line, I'm going to sew through past the dashed line 3 or 4 stitches, just like we did before. Then I'm going to lift my pressure foot and add the next piece. Okay, we're going to take a little break, and I'm going to skip ahead and finish one of these, and then I'm going to show you again how to do the trimming on it. Okay, I'm going to show you guys, I have my block all paper pieced. Now I'm going to show you guys, on the back side we have our TRP lines, so we have to sew those, and on these papers they're actually just called an RP line, which I call them TRP lines. And then I'm going to show you how to trim and how to do the little snippets. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my machine or my papers, and we're going to sew on each one of those. It's a dashed line, it's a little dotted line, and it says RP, and then we're going to lift, go to the next one. Then I'm just going to lift my pressure foot, pull it, go to another one. And there's 5 of those on this particular little flower petal. And I know that seems like a lot, but you need those. Then we're going to lift and go back to, there's one more, and that's over on this side. After you get those done, we're going to grab a pair of scissors out of my toolbox here. And I really like the ones that have the little curved edge on it. And then I'm just going to cut the threads so that we get rid of those, all of the excess thread. And then we're going to cut the threads on the back of the paper. And I don't need to cut the threads along the edge because that's going to get cut off when we trim it. So I'm just cutting the threads that are in the middle of the paper. Right, now I'm going to take my rotary cutter, and I'm going to actually just do free motion curved cutting because I don't have my ruler that I normally use here. So we're going to start right down here, and we're going to slowly cut. And when you're doing free motion, just take your blade and you're going to roll the paper underneath your blade. So your blade's pretty much staying flat or straight as you're doing your cut. And then I just roll the paper around as I'm doing those curves. So we're going to start again. Just stay right on the line. Go slow. And we do have curved rulers that will help you with your curved rulers. And I think in the first demo I did on this, that we're going to reference you back to, I showed you the curved ruler. Okay, so we're cut all the way around, and then it didn't quite get this little thread along that TRP line. Now I'm going to actually take my scissors and cut this inside curve because it's too little to get to with the rotary cutter. So we're going to grab a different pair of scissors, and I'm just going to cut to the inside of that. After I get that done, then we're going to come back up here, and I'm going to snip each one of these little black lines, and that's called a snippet line. And now we have a petal done. So I'm going to refer you back to Judelle, and Judelle will tell you how to get it onto the rest of the videos to finish this leaf, because we've already done those on another video, the assembly.